Check, check. Check, check. One, two, three.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Bidders Conference for the Adult Reentry Grant Program, Rehabilitation of Existing Property. We are here live at the BSCC, but have just a couple of attendees. If you would like to come up and come closer, that would be great. There's just two of you. So please, come on up. We'll get cozy. And there's a few people on the line as well, so we'll just make this cozy and intimate. Yeah, so welcome. I'm glad you're here. And those of you that are viewing through the live stream, welcome to you as well. I'm Colleen Stoner. I'm a lead field rep for this particular project, and I'll let the staff that are around the table introduce themselves as well as our guests. So if you'd like to start, Helene.
Hello, my name is Helene Zentner. I'm a colleague of Ms. Stoner's with the Corrections Planning and Grant Program.
Good morning. My name is Veronica Silva, and I am the program analyst who also works with Colleen on this wonderful project.
Hi, good morning. I'm Aaron McGuire. I'm the General Counsel for the board.
Hello, my name is John Prince. I'm a Deputy Director for the Partner Division for this grant in the CFC Division.
Good morning. I'm Tanya Mashburn. I'm a field rep in the County Facilities Construction Division and assisting in CPGP.
And our guests? Good. Right. Excellent.
Good morning, I'm Katie Howard. I'm the Executive Director here at the BSCC.
And we have IT staff over here, John and Kat, who will be helping us throughout the program today. So the purpose of the Bidders Conference is to provide clarity and information on the request for proposal, the RFP, and to respond to any questions that you might have. We're going to be using this PowerPoint to sort of guide our discussion today and our information. So hopefully those of you who are tuning in through the live stream have accessed the PowerPoint, which was on the front web page, along with a copy of the RFP and two handouts. So hopefully our guests have got those off the table as well. You'll need both the PowerPoint and the RFP because we're going to be walking through the RFP, and that will give you an opportunity to see exactly what we're talking about as you follow along. The individuals that are on the live stream can submit questions to us, and we'll see them as they come in. We may take sort of breaks, natural breaks in the conversation and address those questions. So we might hold them for a bit of time until there's enough of them that we want to stop what we're talking about and answer those. So I'll be looking to Helene and Veronica for assistance in letting me know about the questions, and we'll fold your questions in as well for those of you that are here. The major questions that come forward through this process will be entered into a frequently asked questions document that we will post on our website so we can keep track of changes and responses along the way. There are restrooms here in the downstairs. If you just go around the corner, follow the hallway around, you'll see that there's a restroom, and there's a code to get in, and as you walk out the back door, you'll see a code, and you punch in the code to get into the restrooms. Feel free to take a break whenever you want to. I'm not sure how long this will last, depending on the questions. It may go quickly, or it may go a little more slowly, depending on the interaction of the folks that are tuning in and our guests here today. So our agenda for today is we're going to be talking about the background of the program. I'll do an overview of the RFP, look at the grant requirements, talk a little bit about the scoring of the proposals, and then we will take apart the actual application piece by piece so you're familiar with it and you feel confident in applying for the funding. We'll look at the key dates that are important as you begin the application process, and we'll deal with questions along the way and, of course, at the end as well. So the Adult Reentry Grant Program came to us through a piece of legislation. It's Senate Bill 840, and Senate Bill 840 appropriated $50 million in funding for community-based organizations, CBOs, to support services and resources for people formerly incarcerated in state prison. The funding that is to be awarded to the CBOs were broken out per the legislation into 3 components. The first component was for rental assistance, and $25 million was set aside for that purpose. And then $9,350,000 was set aside for warm handoff and the reentry of offenders transitioning from prison to the community. And then the last component is $15 million that was set aside for the rehabilitation of existing property. We have dealt with the first 2 components, warm handoff and rental assistance. That RFP process began earlier this year. And before it ended, however, the Budget Act of 2019 added $32 million, almost $33 million for both rental and warm handoff that was divided 50-50 between those 2 components. So the warm handoff and reentry services ultimately received $25 million, and rental assistance ultimately received $40 million for those programs. And in July, 69 awards were approved for those 2 components. The third and final component was set aside for us to take a look at some of the issues related to state housing laws and regulations that we needed to research a bit before we could proceed. And so the third component trailed, and we began that when the board awarded, or approved rather, the development of an RFP for the rehab component. And we wrote that RFP and put it out on the web and for public comment, and sent it out to the field for a 30-day public comment period, after which we tweaked the draft RFP, added some things based on input, and then the RFP was approved at the board in August. So this RFP was then issued, it was actually approved in September, but the RFP was then sent out to the field in final form September 13th, and the proposals are due back to us November 1st, 2019. Just a little bit about where you are and a little bit about who we are. You're here at the Board of State and Community Corrections, and we are an organization that reports directly to the governor's office. We're organized by the governor, who appoints 13 members to our board, and our responsibilities have to do with providing leadership and technical assistance to support state and local efforts related to criminal justice and public safety with broad mandates. There are 5 divisions here at the Board of State and Community Corrections. One is the Facility Standards and Operations that deals with inspections, regulation, and compliance of those facilities. The second division is Standards and Training. Those folks deal with setting hiring practices and training, hiring standards and training for probation officers and correctional officers. A third division is our division that deals with the grant management. That's corrections planning and grant programs. And a fourth is the County Facilities Construction Division, which John Prince and Tonya are staffed to. And then the Administration, Research, and Program Support. So there are 5 divisions of the BSCC. We're here, though, to talk about the Adult Reentry Grant Program, and we're going to, as I said, sort of dive into the things that you would find in the RFP. As I mentioned, the proposals are due November 1st. You're to submit one signed original copy that is emailed to us, and we have a specific email box that's listed here on this slide. It's also found within the RFP. You can also submit questions to us at that address as well, and we'll respond to you. It's important that for the duration of this presentation that you use the RFP to help you follow along. And it's also important to keep this particular date in mind, because if we do not receive it by 5 p.m. on November 1st, 2019, we will not be able to accept your application. So on page 2 of the RFP, you'll see the description which is basically, when you boil it down, it's housing for individuals formerly incarcerated in state prison. The grant period is from February 1st, 2019 to January 31st, 2030. So that's a significant chunk of time, 10 years. The funding, however, for the actual construction or reconstruction is available for a 3-year period. So from February 1st, 2019 to January 31st of 2023 is when the funding is available for you, should you be selected, to draw down and use for your rehabilitation project. Applicant eligibility are community-based organizations that are nonprofit. You must have a corporate identity number, and only one proposal per applicant would be accepted. Applicants also need to be able to demonstrate that they have a minimum of 3 years of experience in providing housing services for formerly incarcerated, and that they own and hold title to the property in fee simple that you're proposing to do your rehabilitation of. Let's talk a little bit about subgrantees and subcontractors or partnering with non-governmental organizations. So whether you are a grantee or a subgrantee or a subcontractor, you must be duly organized in existence for at least 2 years prior to entering into an agreement. So anyone that you subcontract with would need to have that meet that requirement as well. Also, you must be registered with the California Secretary of State's office, have a valid business license, an EIN number, employee identification number, and have any other licenses that might be required, and have a physical address. All of the funds have to be used solely for the purpose of rehabbing the property or the buildings to house formerly incarcerated persons from state prison. If you're proposing to do a project that you are using other funding sources for, you have to ensure that that percentage of the funding that is given to you or awarded to you by the BSCC, that you are housing that same percentage of individuals that were formerly incarcerated in state prison. So for example, let's say you're proposing to do an $8 million project, and you applied for $4 million of funding from the BSCC. In that scenario, then we would expect that you would continue to house 50% of your population of individuals who are formerly incarcerated. If you're using 100% of the BSCC funds, then we would expect that the residents in your facility would be 100% formerly incarcerated. We're hoping that you will be able to provide information about your other funding sources as you're applying for the funding. In the budget section of the RFP, there'll be areas that prompt you to tell us about any other funding that you might be contributing to the project. The Adult Reentry Grant is subject to the Welfare and Institutions Code that requires us as a state administering agency that's providing housing and housing-related services to adopt the core components of the Housing First model. And that is one of the handouts that is posted on the web, and it's also one that's back there. And if you look on, I think it's page 2, it begins to tell you what the core components of the Housing First model is. And we also put a handout out there on the table that has a resource list for Housing First information. This requirement comes to us through Senate Bill 1380, and it requires that we employ this type of model, and we oversee our grantees that are getting housing-related funding to make sure that they are implementing a Housing First model. So in terms of what Housing First is, it's an approach to service delivery that recognizes homeless persons first must be able to access decent, safe places to live, and it doesn't limit the length of the stay before stabilizing or improving health or reducing harmful behaviors or increasing income. Under the Housing First model, anyone experiencing homelessness is connected to a permanent home as quickly as possible. And Housing First removes barriers to accessing housing and does not require sobriety or an absence of criminal history. And so for this reason, tenants are not required to participate in services in order to access or retain housing. So those folks that are applying for this funding need to be able to adopt this particular model of service. The target population for this program are, as we've indicated, are people who've been formally sentenced to state prison, and includes people that are on parole or those monitored by probation, or who are PRCSs, those are post-release community supervision individuals. It does not include individuals that were formerly in DJJ or 1170Hs. Eligible projects include transitional housing, permanent housing, and safe haven housing. Applicants have to agree to house the target population all the way until January 31st, 2030. So it's 10 years out. What we mean by existing property is that it's real property owned by the applicant in fee simple at the time of application. And that just is a legal term that means absolute tenure in the land with freedom to dispose of it at will. And it's the main type of land ownership. Rehabilitation means repairs and improvements to housing or bringing them up to standards. And we've referenced a couple of health and safety codes that talk about the requirements in law regarding that. And rehabilitation may include reconstruction as well. You may use your grant funds. If you look on page 4 of the RFP, there's a list of things that you can do with funding that are considered eligible costs. You may use up to 10% of your funds for administrative costs for the CBO personnel. You can use the funds for on-site costs of reconstruction or architectural programming or reconstruction management, building permits, other permits, inspection fees. For soil, water contamination, fixed equipment necessary for operations or furnishing necessary for operations, or the installation of the fixed equipment and furnishings, movable equipment and furnishings, and preparation of property to meet environmental requirements. On page 4, there's also a list of things that you cannot be reimbursed for, and one is acquisition of new property, refinancing of old debt or operational funding, delivery of services, dislocation or displacement, excavation of burial sites, off-site costs, office supplies and equipment, bonus payments, public art or decor. I had a question come in, I believe it was yesterday, about whether or not the individual could use the funding for, they had already owned a piece of property and they wanted to build on it. It could not be used for that purpose. In terms of funding, which is on page 5 of your RFP, there's $15 million available, and applicants must apply for a minimum amount of $2 million and a maximum of $5 million. There's a 20% cash match required, and as we've indicated before, you must be able to house persons formerly incarcerated from state prison for the duration of the grant period ending in January 31st, 2030. And operating budgets, occupancy reports upon completion of the construction project will be required annually from each grantee. Pages 5 through 10 are talking about additional grant requirements. Applicants approved for the funding are going to be required to enter into a grant agreement with the BSCC. And there is a sample grant agreement on page 30 in the back of your RFP if you want to if you want to know what those look like. That is just a sample, and the terms and conditions of the actual grant, should you be awarded, may change before it's executed, but at least it gives you kind of an idea of what you would expect to see in a grant agreement or a contract. And contracts or grant agreements are not considered fully executed until after they're signed by the BSCC. We will ask you to submit a board resolution from your governing board that the individual signing for the application is authorized on behalf of the governing board to submit the grant proposal and sign the grant agreement and any amendments thereof. It makes things much, much easier if you are able to secure a board resolution that names both the individual and the title of the person who has this is the signatory for authorized signatory. The labor code requires that individuals that would be funded through this project pay prevailing wages for certain kinds of developments paid for through public funding, and this might trigger some of those requirements. And each applicant is responsible for determining on a case-by-case basis the extent of the applicability of the state's prevailing wage law. And we may require that you provide us with written certification that prevailing wages have been paid or will be paid, and that you keep records maintaining support of this.
Colleen, we have an online question.
Okay.
The question is, can applications be from a partnership between property owner and service provider?
Say that question again.
Sure. Can applications be from a partnership between property owner and service provider?
So the applicant must be a nonprofit CBO, and they also must be the owner of the property.
Okay, thank you. We have an additional question.
Okay.
Are we to use state or federal prevailing wages or both?
I think that's a legal question.
And I'm not an expert in prevailing wage at all, but this would be presumably the state labor code governs this requirement, so it would be the state prevailing wages.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So I think this section belongs to you, Aaron. We're going to have you do the next couple of sections, I think. Oh, actually, I think I'm doing this one. No, this is you, all you. We have a couple of slides that deal with legalistic kinds of issues in areas that I think are better suited to Aaron's background. So I'll have you deal with these next three.
I will do my best. This is at least described a little bit on page 5 of the grant agreement. This is how we intend to secure an interest in the property. And it's almost structured in some ways like a loan, but the important thing to remember is this is a grant program, which means so long as the terms and conditions of the program are met, there's no payback of the grant fees at all. But if, and we hope this never happens as part of this program, but if the property is sold prematurely or if the nonprofit dissolves for whatever reason, it's a way for the state to sort of recover its interests in the grant funds that were set out. So what we would expect to happen as part of this process, and we're still working on securing some additional legal counsel in order to help with this, what we would normally term as sort of real estate due diligence, is we would expect as part of the entering into the grant agreement process, executing and delivering a promissory note in the amount of the grant award, and that we would secure a deed of trust on the property, naming the BSCC as the beneficiary, and that we would record those liens or encumbrances. We would want to make sure that, for example, if the property was, let's say, just worth $2 million, but there was already $18 million of debt against the property, there's no lien we could attach to that property where we would be able to get our money back. So we just want to make sure there's an ability for us to get, again, if the property is sold prematurely before the end of the grant program, that the BSCC can recover some of those funds. So we're going to ask for a preliminary title report and to ask the grantees to enter in any kind of subordination agreements that are necessary to make sure that the lien that we attach is able to recover some of those funds. We don't expect it to be necessarily the primary lien. We expect most likely it'll be a bank that will be holding a mortgage on the property that will have sort of the primary position. But again, there can't be so much other interest recorded against the property that the board won't be able to recover any funds if the grantee gets an award. And again, so that lien would be basically effective during the term of the grant until January 31, 2030, assuming that persons leaving state prison were housed during the duration of the period of the grant and all the terms and conditions were met. We would return that deed basically back to the grantee. There would be no obligation to, again, repay back any of the grant funds, and then the property would be free and clear from that BSCC lien. We would require, though, that the ability for the board, and again, we absolutely never want to exercise this authority, but we will require a provision that would allow the board to foreclose upon the property if it's sold prematurely or it's not being used for the purposes of the grant program. But again, that would be the absolute last resort. We would work with the grantees at every step of the way to make sure that there are alternative ways to make sure that the program is successful. I think the next slide. Want to talk a little bit about, most likely you'll have to get some sort of conditional use permit from a local government entity, and that's going to be required within 90 days of the conditional award. These projects we've identified because the state is providing the funding for these projects, that triggers what's known as the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. And the funded projects that we're going to do, which means effectively the board has to say that there's not going to be a significant environmental impact for these projects. It's the board's obligation to certify that fact. And so we're only going to fund projects that are going to be limited to have no significant effect on the environment or are statutorily or categorically exempt from the CEQA process. We would expect, and if you don't know what that means, CEQA is a pretty complicated area of law, and we'd encourage folks here and then that are watching live stream to consult an attorney about this. But there's basically what are known as categorical exemptions from the CEQA process that are outlined in regulations that are described as Class 1, Class 2, or Class 3. Those are basically projects that are really rehabilitation projects. So the existing structure, for the most part, would remain intact with some minor expansion of a footprint, but it wouldn't cover most likely a full demolition of a property and a reconstruction of a new project. That most likely, but again, I would encourage you to either consult an attorney, or we provided a link in the RFP to the Department of Resources, the Natural Resources Agency's website, which has the 2019 CEQA statutes and guidelines. As part of our application process, we have an Appendix C, which we ask you to fill out or have legal counsel fill out. Basically, we are asking you to provide sufficient information for us to certify that, again, that the project falls into one of those Class 1, Class 2, Class 3. Most likely, there's also some other classes that it might fall into as well, so that we can give that to our CEQA attorney and allow us to file what's called a Notice of Exemption with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. We actually had the RFP that we put out for public comment before the formal release of this RFP actually required the applicant to file that paperwork with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. For those who might have looked at that earlier version, we switched it as part of the release upon recommendation of our legal counsel. The board will take on that responsibility to file that paperwork with the Office of Planning and Research, but we do need to get sufficient information from our prospective grantees to fill out that paperwork as well. What that does, once we file with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, that triggers a 35-day statute of limitations period, which gives basically its notice to the community or anyone that might be affected by the building project an opportunity to challenge whether or not there's any environmental impact. What we hope will happen is that no one will challenge the determination by the board that the project is exempt. If there is a legal challenge, we will deal with those as they come. But at some point, we may, if we can't resolve the environmental impacts issues, we may not be able to proceed with the construction of the project, given the sort of short timeline that we have in order to expend the funds. We can't engage into a super lengthy conditional use permit or CEQA litigation process that might occur. So just be aware of that. We're hoping that prospective grantees that are already somewhere in the process, having gone through CEQA at the local level, that this will just be sort of the state step in order to clear that hurdle as well. And then we can proceed after that 35-day period has cleared.
Thanks very much. If you look at page 51 of your RFP, you'll see the Appendix C that Aaron was talking about. And it's a pretty simple form. I don't think it'll be too hard to explain or to have filled out, but that will need to be included in your package. Okay.
Colleen, before you begin, we have an additional question.
Okay.
Regarding Housing First requirements, does that apply to licensed residential treatments serving the target population?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on. We've already talked a bit about cash match. There's a 20% cash match, and funds from government sources other than the BSCC, including federal funds, can be used for the cash match, provided that funding allows for that type of use that's found in the scope of the ARG rehab project. Eligible cash match expenditures only include those that were listed that we talked about earlier on that eligible funding list. Projects are also required to use a general contractor, and under the supervision of the construction manager, the general contractor would be responsible for the day-to-day oversight of the project, management of vendors and trades, and the communication of information to all involved. We would expect a 3-bid process to hire a general contractor. The bids should be based on a criteria that's determined by the grantee and has been established in order to screen out unqualified contractors. However, the grantee is not required to select the lowest bid. And as Aaron indicated, a title report is due at the time of application. It can be a preliminary title report that's current within a 30-day window of submitting your application to the BSCC. So disbursement of grant funds occurs on a reimbursement basis. However, the reimbursement will begin only after the grantee has executed a subcontract with the general contractor. So in other words, we're not going to begin reimbursement until we know that you have a general contractor in place and ready to move forward. And during the 3-year period of funding availability, grantees must submit invoices, which will have a little bit of a progress report built into it, with supporting documentation to the BSCC on a monthly basis, within 45 days following the end of the reporting period. And we will provide you with all of that information, so you will know what that is should you be selected. And grantees are required to maintain supporting documentation for all costs claimed on the invoices for reimbursement. And we know that, that given this reimbursement schedule and the processing time involved, it's important for you to be thinking about that so that you can plan accordingly for any cash flow issues related to your project. 5% of the grant award will be retained once we get to that level. So once 95% of the funding has been issued to the grantee, we will hold 5% until completion of the rehabilitation of property occurs and the grantee is housing formerly incarcerated individuals or accepting requests for housing from persons formerly incarcerated. And during that first 3 years of funding availability, grantees will continue to report to the BSCC annually by submitting proof of insurance, an annual operating budget, and an annual occupancy report. And that will continue on until January 31st, 2030. Excuse me. BSCC grant funds shall be used to support new rehabbing of existing property or to augment existing funds that expand current rehabbing activities that are already underway. But the BSCC funds cannot be used to replace existing funds that were already established for that purpose. This is called supplanting, and it's strictly prohibited by the BSCC. There is no audit requirement. However, we do reserve the right to call for a program or a financial audit at any time between the execution of the contract and 3 years later. We will expect you to obtain and maintain appropriate insurance prior to the start of the construction and for the duration of the grant award. This includes fire, lightning, and extended coverage insurance, as well as earthquake, in an amount equal to the fully insurable value of the project. There is likely to be a grantee orientation meeting. We typically have that for all of our new projects that are launched. Depending on the number and the type of the grantees that are awarded, we may bring you all together for an orientation here in Sacramento, or we may decide to do that one-on-one. So that'll be determined as we move forward. But you should, in your budget, plan for at least one meeting in Sacramento with relevant staff individuals. That would be, you know, your project manager, your day-to-day contact person, people that are key to your project.
Colleen, we have an insurance question. Are insurance costs through the construction period eligible costs to be allocated to this grant?
Yes.
Thank you.
I was conferring with our construction person.
Okay. All right. It's a policy of the BSC to protect grant funds from unreasonable risks of fraudulent, criminal, or other improper use. And given that, we won't go into any contracts or provide reimbursement to applicants that have been disbarred by any federal or state or local government. And if convicted of those things, we would not do business with a grantee for 3 years following the conviction. We require grantees to provide an assurance that there's been no applicable disbarment, disqualification, or suspension or removal from federal, state, or local grant programs at the time of application. And there's a form for that, and it's on page 52. Flip back to page 52. It's called Appendix D. And that is part of your application packet, and you will need to make sure that you fill that out and turn that in to us. We will conduct site visits or monitoring periodically throughout the project to see how things are progressing and to take a look at your fiscal accounting of the project. And those are done. It sort of depends on each project, but you can expect us to come out and take a look at your project at least once a year. Here is a list of key dates. It's on page 11 and 12. These are important for you to remember and to keep in mind. The most important maybe of all is that November 1st, close of business, that's 5 o'clock. You would need to submit your emailed application to us. And then the rating of those proposals will occur during the months of November and December. We will take the recommended awards to the board for a funding approval in January, and then the grant and contracts would commence February 1st. All right, talking about scoring panels or scoring committees, there are going to be 5 factors upon which the proposals will be evaluated, and we're going to go over those in detail in a few minutes. The funding decisions will be made on the basis of the scores of each of the proposals. You'll be notified that when we receive your proposal, and you would be further notified if we disqualified your proposal from the scoring process. And we'll talk about disqualification a little bit later in the presentation. The scoring let me back up a little bit. We typically use an executive steering committee process for scoring, where stakeholders and subject matter experts inform the decision-making process. For this RFP, a scoring committee is going to be used. The committee members represent subject matter experts from different disciplines, geographical areas, gender, race, ethnicities. And they'll be tasked with reading and rating the proposals and developing the award recommendations. The scoring committee members will receive formal BSCC training. They'll read and the assigned proposals in accordance with the training and the prescribed rating factors. Any scoring member that has an actual or perceived conflict with a particular proposal would recuse themselves and not participate in scoring that particular proposal. We have a conflict of interest policy that says that any grantee or sub-grantee who participated in a scoring committee or an executive steering committee, they are prohibited from receiving the funds. So in other words, any committee member that's sitting on the scoring panel could not be an applicant or could not receive funds or could not be a sub-grantee. So that's something to think about. We will post the committee members on our website by October 15th, so you'll know who they all are. Many of the members have already committed, and many of them were the executive steering committee members from the previous 2 rounds. But anyway, I think that's important for you to keep in mind, that you could not subcontract with someone who had been a scoring panel member. So in terms of rating factors, there are 5: program need, program description, organizational capacity, readiness, and a budget section. There's a 5-point range of scale that's used to evaluate each of these rating factors, and each factor has been given a % of the total value. So in other words, the program need is 15% of your score. The program description is 35% of your score. Organizational capacity would weigh at 15%, and readiness is 15%, and budget section is 20%. So a total value of 100% is achieved. Each of those areas, based on their weight, is given a rating factor score. So you'll see off to the right, program need is weighted at 30, description 70, organizational capacity at 30, readiness 30, budget section 40, for a total of 200 weighted score. The threshold minimum to be considered is 120 points. So in other words, if you scored less than 120 points, you would not be eligible to receive funding. The 5-point rating scale is based on the following. A poor response is considered very inadequate and would receive a score of 1. If the response addresses criteria in a nonspecific or unsatisfactory way, you would receive a score of 2. If the response addressed the criteria in an adequate way, the committee or the rating individual would give you a 3. And if the response addressed the criteria in a substantial way, you receive a 4. And if the response addressed the criteria in an outstanding way, you'd receive a 5. So each committee member uses this rubric to evaluate the responses that you will be putting in your proposal. So it's important for you to kind of think about that as you're moving through the narrative section of the proposal, of the application, as well as the budget. So let's just take the application apart piece by piece. There's a list of application components starting on, oh, thank you. There's a list of application components. The first is a cover sheet, which is on page 15. So let's turn to page 15. I will do it too. Go to stay up on this. So on page 15, this is the cover sheet that you would put on the front of your application. You just put your name and the date. And the next page, page 16 is a checklist that requires you to look at these 12 items. All 12 items need to be included in your application packet. It needs to be signed at the bottom and dated at the bottom. It's a good way to make sure that you're putting everything in that you need into your application, but it's also required that you submit this checklist and that it's signed. On page 17, there is instructions about how to complete pages 18 and 19. So if you look at 18 and 19, that's the application information form. And it's just asking about kind of broad information about your organization, but it has some critical pieces that are related to your corporate entity number and your tax identification number. You should look this over ahead of time. We know that's sort of a short window of time to get these applications in, and if you need to track down this information, it's important that you know you've kind of looked at this ahead of time so you'll know what you need to be working on first. On section F on page 18, it asks for a summary of the rehabbing project. What you type in here or what you put in here is what will be, if you're selected, is what will be posted to our website in terms of public information about your project. So you want to make sure that whatever you're putting in here you think is adequate for public review and describes your program well. Make sure that you sign this form on page 19 in blue ink only, and that you date it. Moving on to page 20. This begins the information on the narrative and the budget. Catch up with you here. Okay. And let's see here. Yeah. Okay. So the narrative proposal, or the proposal for this project, as we've talked about, has a project need, project description, organizational capacity, and readiness to proceed. Those are the 4 sections in the narrative that you will be addressing. Oh, keep going, wrong way. And each section of your narrative needs to be titled according to the section header. So if you are beginning to write about the project need, you would put the header project need and then begin writing underneath it. And within each section, we want you to address the information that's requested in the rating factors, the sub-factors, in a cohesive and comprehensive way. We don't want you to include any web links, charts, graphs, or other graphics. You're allowed up to 15 pages for the narrative, and we would like you to number those pages at the bottom 1 through 15 so that we can see clearly that you haven't exceeded the number of pages that you're allowed. And we'll deal with the budget sections separately. So we're still on page 20 through 22, and unless otherwise noted, each narrative section must be formatted in a 12-point font, 1.5 line spacing with 1-inch margins, and again, 15-page narrative section. I've made a detailed slide for this first rating factor, which is program needs. We'll go over it kind of as an example, and then we'll review the others more generally. So on page 20, it lists the project need and the sub-factors that are included. We'll want you to explain the conditions within the community, including any housing gaps that can be addressed by the proposal. Describe the extent to which the project will address the needs of the grant's target population, and describe relevant key local quantitative or qualitative data to support the need. Those 3 sub-factors are then going to be reviewed and evaluated by the rating panel using that rubrics that we've already talked about that's placed here at the bottom of the slide, and they'll determine whether your response to program need was poor, fair, satisfactory, good, or excellent. Keeping in mind that program need is weighted at 15% of your proposal, so it's up to you to determine how to use your 15 pages in addressing the narrative section. However, as a guide, the percent total value is a good way to sort of direct you how much emphasis that you will put on a particular section. So moving over to page 22, or 21 rather, the program description, I didn't put it all there, but you can see that it's weighted at, if you're on page 21, you'll see that there are 8 sub-factors. And this section is weighted at 35%. It's has the heaviest weight of all of the sections. So you'll make your own decision about how much emphasis you want to put on this particular section. But again, realizing that the scoring committee will be using the rubric to determine how well you address sub-factors 2.1 through 2.8. On page 22 is the organizational capacity section. It's weighted at 15%. And the readiness to proceed is also weighted at 15%. And then that brings us to the proposal budget. And the proposal budget is on page 22 through 26. And the budget section is addressed by completing a budget table that includes some line item detail. And the budget table is accessed through a link to an Excel document that's contained in the RFP. And that's on page 23. If you turn to page 23, you'll see about halfway through, there's a link there that's underscored, and you click on that and it will take you to an Excel workbook that will assist you in putting in the budget information. The budget section does not count towards the 15 pages of the narrative section. So you simply complete the Excel workbook, and well, before we get to that, there is also a budget description that you will complete using a template. But all of the information that is in the budget table, the Excel workbook, and in the budget template will be capturing the following sub-factors of the project budget. And the project budget is weighted at 20%. So within your Excel workbook and within the budget template, you want to make sure that you're addressing sub-factors 5.1 through 5.4. And keep in mind that, again, the budget is evaluated by using the rubric that we've looked at several times over. Okay, so Veronica, my colleague Veronica Silva, is going to walk us through the Excel workbook and some of the specifics of completing the budget section.
Thank you, Colleen. But before we begin, we do have an online question for you, which is, we have a general governing board resolution stating that our CEO is authorized to sign and submit proposals on behalf of the organization. Do we need a resolution specific to this proposal?
No, you do not need a resolution specific to the ARG grant, as long as the resolution calls out the individual that has signing authority by title, and name would be great as well, because if it's only title, then we'll also need some proof that the individual signing is actually holds that position within your organization.
Thank you. Sorry, Colleen, we have one more question.
Okay.
On page 10, it states budget description 1.5 line spacing. Then on page 23, it says the budget description must be double spaced and cannot exceed 5 pages in length using the template provided below.
That's a really smart question. We ran into that too. The template that you'll be completing for the budget section is already formatted at double spaced. So you'll simply be entering your information into that template, which will force you to do double spaced, and that's just how the template is.
Thank you, Colleen. Okay, good morning. As Colleen mentioned, my name is Veronica Silva, and I'll be covering the budget attachment as well as a portion, as well as the budget narrative section. So what I will be covering is where you can actually locate the budget attachment within the RFP, and then also using the new attachment. I would like to note that although it says that I will be covering the RFP funding, Colleen has already gone over that, so I'll just skip that portion and then move along with the requirements and the budget table and the budget description. So I'd like to begin with starting on our BSCC home webpage, which you'll notice at the very top under the Go to BSCC homepage, I've listed our web address. From there, if you were to scroll down midway down the page, you'll see the Adult Reentry Grant Rehab of Existing Property Project. You would go there to access the Adult Reentry Grant page. This has a pointer, right? So I could show them. I'm not sure if they can see, but from there, it'll take you to the Adult Reentry Grant RFP page. You'll see I've highlighted in the red box for those of you following online. That very first gray box, if you select that box, it'll bring you to a drop-down section, which will then shortly down the page, you'll see a small highlighted box where it has the Word document. That is the link, and that will take you to the actual RFP in Word format. So you'll want to select that link. And for those of you here following along with the hard copy, this is what, once you open up the RFP, it's on page 23, midway down the page, you'll see the box that lists out the rehab project budget attachment link, and that is the Excel format that Colleen mentioned earlier. So again, this is within the RFP, and we've located the RFP off our BSCC webpage. So now I'm going to cover a few of the requirements when filling out the budgeted Excel. So the first thing I would like to note is that funds to be requested in whole dollar amounts. We ask that you please do not use decimals. Moving along, also The budget line items are listed to those contained in the budget attachment, which are as follows. The administrative, which is salaries and benefits, subcontracts, architectural planning, additional eligible cost, and other, which includes travel. Third, if no money is requested for a particular line item, we ask that you enter 0 in the budget table and an A in the corresponding narrative. Now I'll begin with using the budget table, the Excel document. So at the very top, you'll want to begin with entering in your CBO name. It's the section right above that red box that I've highlighted. Following that, I would like to notate that the information that is, I guess it doesn't reach, never mind. Sorry, guys. The top portion of the budget table is locked. So you'll notice that if you were to try to go into the template and forward that column where it's A, B, C, D, and E, you will not be able to enter in any kind of dollar amount. The dollars will automatically populate as you scroll down to the budget detail information. It will auto-populate those dollar amounts up to the top there and do all the totaling for you. So now I will cover briefly the 5 budget categories. So I'll begin with the administrative salaries and benefits. We ask that you list the CBO staff to be funded by the grant for oversight of the grant project. Provide the classification/title, the percent of time, salary and hourly rates and benefits. Please note that salaries and benefits of all other contracted staff go under the line item of subcontractors. Applicants must also document and retain timesheets for any grant or match funds charged to this grant. Moving along with subcontractors, list the company or person hired as the general contractor with whom the grantee will subcontract to perform part or all of the obligations of the BSCC grant agreement. This line item may include other subcontractors as needed. Architectural planning. Costs related to architectural plans and specifications may include outline specifications such as equipment and furnishing, floor plans, to scale with dimensions, room design, references, wall types and ratings, building sections such as heights and dimensions, interior evaluations, and preliminary structural, mechanical, and electrical drawings. Additional eligible cost, we ask that you refer to page 4. Colleen has also covered these earlier in her presentation. It includes a list of eligible cost and non-eligible costs. Finally, other, which is travel, will include itemizing all costs associated with travel for one trip to Sacramento for the grantee orientation. Costs should include travel and per diem for project director, day-to-day contact person, and the fiscal manager. Now this will bring us into the budget description, which is a separate document mentioned earlier. This can be found on page 4 of the RFP. Real quick, just a couple of the requirements. The purpose is to support the amounts requested in the Excel document and further respond to the budget rating factors. Some of these requirements include submitting an Arial 12-point font with 1-inch margins on all 4 sides, and that it be double spaced. It cannot exceed 5 pages in length. You must use the template provided, which again is on page 4. Provide the information for each line item with a narrative to explain how the requested grant funds, cash match, and any additional funds contributing to the project will be used to achieve project goals. And finally, the numbers entered in the template below must match those populated in the budget template. Again, that's the Excel document.
Veronica, the template is actually on page 23 through 26, just not page 4.
Oh, I'm sorry. So here's what the template looks like on page 24, right? 24. I believe it's 24. Yeah. So you'll be able to enter in your information in those gray shaded areas. I just wanted to provide a sample of what this may look like. Again, it's to provide a narrative description of the items and how the items and requested grant funds, cash match, and any additional funds will serve to meet the stated goals and objectives and planned activities of the project. And with that being said, unless anybody has questions, I'd be turning it over to you, Colleen.
Yes, we do have a question online, Veronica, for you. And it may have cleared up with the presentation that you just provided, but we are confused as to where we enter the budget description. Isn't it a separate narrative? Based on your response to the 1.2 versus 2.0 line spacing, it seems we enter the budget description in the Excel document.
Yeah, that is a great question. I can see the confusion. So again, there's the Excel document where you will enter in your dollar amounts. The description, as Colleen mentioned and corrected, is on page 24. It's already automatically 2-point line spacing. So you have initially 2 separate documents you'll be submitting. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I missed the part where they said disregard because you did such a wonderful job explaining it.
Okay.
During it. But we have a second question, though I do not believe it has to do with you. It will be towards Colleen. So does anyone in the room have any questions? Okay. Is it about the budget or? It's about everything. Oh, okay, we'll do that. So the question, Colleen, do you want to answer that now?
Sure.
Okay. The question is, if the building is placed on the National Registry of Historic Buildings, could this funding be used for the historical preservation costs?
Wow,
That's a good question.
it's a good one. Say it again, Helene.
My pleasure. If the building is placed on the National Registry of Historic Buildings, could this funding be used for the historical preservation costs?
Go ahead, Aaron.
I don't know. I would lean towards yes, depending on it. What we wouldn't want to see is, assuming it's part of the rehabilitation and ongoing maintenance of the structure, I think it would be okay. If it was an existing expense that was already,
Budgeted for.
but that they were already had to pay for, I think that gets a little bit more murky. But it would probably be okay. That's sort of what I'm going with right now. But we'd probably need some more information, and I'd probably have to do a little legal research on that. So.
Okay, thank you.
I would recommend, we will take this question for sure, but the individual whose question this is, if you would like to email me, and I'll forward that to Aaron, and we'll take it under advisement and get back to you. We'll also include it, of course, in the FAQs, but I think it would be helpful, especially if you're trying to determine whether or not you're going to apply. If you need this information, that you email me with that question, and we'll put it on our immediate to-do list. But that's a pretty good question.
No, it was an interesting one.
You win the door prize for good questions. All right. So, I also wanted to say, because we didn't mention it in the budget section, for that Excel document that you'll be completing, when you open it up, there are 2 tabs at the bottom. One is a tab for instructions, and the second one is the actual form, the Excel format. Form to fill out. So there is some detailed instructions that will help you fill out that Excel document. So let's talk about the project activity timeline, which is on page 27. And if you take a look at that, pull that up or turn to it. Okay. So this is part of your application packet, and you'll need to turn that in for sure. But the timeline is also prompted in rating factors 2.3 and 3.2, which is in the project description. Subfactor 2.3 prompts you to fill out this activity timeline that will be used to evaluate your response to 2.3. And it's also prompted under organizational capacity. There's a subfactor that advises you to complete the project activity in response to that subfactor under organizational capacity on page 22. All right, let's talk about disqualification. It is possible that your application could be disqualified from being forwarded to the scoring committee, and it would not be evaluated, and it would be returned to you. On page 10 of your RFP, and I'd like you all to turn to page 10, because on that page it clearly says what could cause a proposal to be automatically disqualified. We've talked about a lot of these things, so you now know what these forms are or what these documents are, but let's review this together. So on page 10, you must submit a PDF electronic version of your proposal package by 5 p.m. November 1st. The proposal narrative, the budget description, if they don't meet the narrative formatting of 12-point Arial, 1-inch margins, and 1.5 spacing, that could be a disqualifying issue. If your proposal exceeds 15 pages in length, that could disqualify you. If your budget description exceeds 5 pages in numbered length, and that's that template, so it can't be longer than 5 pages. And if your proposal package does not contain all the required sections, the cover sheet, the checklist, the information sheet, the proposal narrative, the budget attachment in Excel, the budget description, which is the template, and your activity timeline, that could disqualify you. If you requested under $2 million or over 5, that could be a disqualifying issue. And if you did not check the boxes on the certification of compliance, that was Appendix D. Remember, we looked at that a while back. That could be could disqualify you. If you don't provide a governing board resolution with that confers authority to the signatory by name and title, that could disqualify you. And if you don't provide proof that you're a CBO registered to do business in the state of California and that you're active in good standing with the Secretary of State for the last 3 years, that could disqualify you. You will need to submit a copy of your registration and active status as identified on the Secretary of State's database. And there's a link that would take you directly to the Secretary of State's database where you could ensure that you are properly registered there. We would want a screenshot or a copy of it showing that you are in good status and active status, and a letter of determination by the IRS, or you could send in your most recent 990 form, rather. If you don't submit a preliminary title report that's current within 30 days of the application, that could disqualify you. And if you did not complete Appendix C, which was that preliminary information for notice of exemption that Aaron talked about. So again, disqualification means that the proposal would not move to the scoring committee for the proposal rating process. So these are rather stringent and sort of rigid requirements with not a lot of wiggle room, and we want it to be super clear with everybody that all of these things must be met in order to qualify you to be scored by the scoring committee. So let's just review the 12 forms that are to be included in your package. There's a cover sheet, the proposal checklist, applicant information form, 15-page proposal narrative or less, the budget table in Excel, the budget template, 5 pages or less, the project activity timeline, Appendix D, which is the debarment, fraud, theft, embezzlement compliance, and verification of your 501c3 status, and a letter of a 990 form, and a letter of determination from the IRS, a preliminary title report, current within 30 days, notice of exemption form, page 51, Appendix C, and a board resolution with signing authority by name and title. So those 12 documents need to be part of your application package. Applicants must submit one original signed copy via email by November 1st, 5 p.m. And the signed originals are to be sent to that mailbox on this slide. And if you have questions beyond what we talk about today or were able to address today, you can submit those questions to me at my personal email or to the electronic ARG Rehab Project mailbox. So to-dos, read the RFP all the way through several times. I say that every single time we do a bidders conference, and so very often I start receiving questions and it's clear that the person that's talking with me or writing to me has really not read the RFP. My recommendation is to read it several times before you even begin writing the proposal. Sometimes it's tempting just to get to the forms that have to be filled out, but you'll do much, much better if you actually read it through, all the way through, and are super familiar with all the components of the application. Be familiar with the program requirements, complete all required documents on the checklist, and we've kind of gone over that ad nauseum, so hopefully that will be an easy thing for you to do. Be familiar with the rating factors and sub-factors. That's how you're going to be evaluated. And follow the proposal submittal instructions to the letter. So I'll take any questions that you've been holding or that have surfaced in the last little bit.
Okay. So my first question is the NGO considered a partner? Oh, I know they're considered a partner, but are they considered an applicant on the application?
No, they would not.
Okay, so that's why the property has to be occupied by the
Has to be,
CBO.
yeah, it has to be owned by the CBO.
Got it. And then my other question is, a 20% match, can that be used towards operations or it has to be used towards rehab as well?
Has to be used towards rehab.
Okay.
Can't be for services.
And when do you have to have the 20% match?
Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be upfront, but you have to be able to, you're going to fill out a budget and it's going to lay out the line items to which you're going to assign your 20%. And you have to be able to expend those dollars throughout the project. We don't necessarily, and my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, but typically we don't look to see like, oh, you spent 20% of your BSCC funds, you have to spend 20% of your cash match. We don't necessarily look at it like that. But if you had, let's say you've gone through a year of work and you hadn't contributed any cash match, you hadn't claimed any of that, then we'd be talking to you about what's going on, why not. We certainly wouldn't want you to wait until the very end of the project. Now, I'll turn it over to my colleague who might want to expound on that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And what I think we've asked people to do is to sort of identify your sources of income. So, for example, if you have a revenue stream either through fundraising or something else where you expect, this is sort of what our income will look like over the next 3 years as we're doing the construction, or 2 years. And you can point to that with some certainty that, we will have this money available. We don't necessarily have cash in hand right now. I think we would look to that. But we would definitely want you to at least identify where the match is going to be coming from.
Right. And, some red flags for us would be, like I said, if we've gone through, the first year and you haven't contributed any match, then we'd probably circle around with you and talk to you about, do you have it? What's the plan? How come you're not contributing some? But we understand that it doesn't always flow in on the front end.
And I would say part of the 5% retention that we're holding is also to ensure that that 20% match is used by the CBOs, because the portion of the state funding can be reduced if you don't put up the full 20% that's listed in your budget. So say you put up 19%, then there'd be a small portion of the state grant that you wouldn't be eligible to receive to bring the CBO up to that 20% total that the project is.
And why is the minimum 2 million?
Well, we were looking at ways in which we could offer this to projects that had substantial projects in play and that were going to move forward. We had considered other options as well, because we know that there are people that might have really small projects to do. But we wanted this to go out to projects that had substantial projects that were going to really increase their capacity or increase their standards in a major way. Have any other thoughts about that? I mean, we did kick that around for quite some time.
Yeah, it was.
Okay. Okay.
Also, does the property, thank you, how long does the property have to be owned by the CBO?
I mean, prior to the application? Know that we stated that there is a minimum time period that you have to have purchased the property prior to the application.
Okay. and-
But you do have to be an owner at the time of application.
So by
Right.
November 1st, you must own the property.
Okay. And then also, can it be used for more than one dwelling unit on one lot?
Yes, no problem with that.
We'd like multiple dwelling units.
Yes. Well, I'm partnering with a lot of real estate investors who are really, really into criminal justice and giving back. So I want to really focus on our target population, right? We really want to get them housed. So if I can get access to property to people who are willing to put our target population into these houses on a large mass, that's what I'm trying to do. So if I can get that property switched over to CBO by November 1st, then that wouldn't be an issue, right?
Right, and it's the CBO that has to be the applicant,
Right.
And make sure we do have to have that preliminary title report, so
30 days.
that's within 30 days. So I would shoot for, if you're trying to have property switched over to the CBO, that happened well before November 1st, hopefully, early October, so that there is time to have that preliminary title report done, because that does take time as well. And so they're going to look back and they want to see, that there has been that title change. So if it happens on November 1st, you're not going to have time to have the preliminary title report completed to show that, generally speaking.
That's 30 days after that. I don't know if it states that 30 days after.
It's
the
30 days
application?
prior to
Prior to.
Application.
the application.
Okay.
So the title report it's basically saying the title report has to be current. So it can't be the title report can't be 45 days old when November 1st rolls around, because things may happen. It can be 3 days old. So you could do, the title report could be dated October 31st. That's okay. We just need to make sure that it's as current as possible, so that nothing maybe has happened, property sold or some sort of other deed attached to the property prior to the application.
Okay. And then my last question, so I know that this project, or BSCC, really focuses on permanent housing, but it also listed transitional housing as an option. So what is considered permanent housing as far as time frame goes for transitional housing? Is it 6 months max, year max?
I think you can do either.
Okay.
But you do have to employ the housing first tenants and the components of that. So would kind of point you in the direction of making sure that you're able to support all of those.
Okay, so if I'm the fiscal sponsor of the organization that has been doing the work for the 3 years, can I apply for the money for the organization? Like the organization might be small, little,
Uh-huh.
and we fiscally sponsor them. So is it okay for our organization to go ahead and apply for the funds, even though the home or the apartment building is in the smaller organization's name?
So there's a smaller organization, are they the property owner?
Yes.
No, couldn't do that. So the applicant has to be a CBO, nonprofit CBO, and be the owner of the property.
They have to do it themselves.
Colleen, I do have another online question.
Okay.
So on page 7 of the RFP, under the subcontractors,
Oh, thanks.
a 3-bid process for the general contractor is required, confirming that is post-award, correct?
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you.
I think I just have one last question. So you said that so you said that if the organization dissolves or sells or whatever, so say you are in business for like 9 years and you asked for the $2 million, would you just prorate the $2 million by the 10 years and make me pay back 1/10 of it?
Yeah, I mean, right now, we're not prorating anything. Given, and just given the length of the grant right now too, which is actually a pretty short period of time in terms of a real property transaction, no, there's no prorating.
Okay. He's gone. I think that's it.
Okay, any more online? Okay, well then that concludes our bidders conference. I thank everyone for participating and for your interest in this project. And I encourage you to contact me if another question comes up or you have any more information. Feel free to reach out to me and I'll be glad to connect back with you. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.